Today, as you know, I make no presentation, and all of our time is devoted simply to discussion. Students who are enrolled through the law school, law students or others who have enrolled through the law school, should remain for a few minutes after class to do the course evaluation procedure. Now, as to the discussion, of course, it's fine to ask questions, but I hope you won't only ask questions, that you'll also make comments, propose lines of inquiry that I have not explored here, and in general, give me advice and instruction. So I'm at your disposal. Yes?
So I have a question from a student in my section that I thought was an interesting critique.
Yes.
You've critiqued the cause of equality on the left as not enough. And in exchange, you propose shared bigness.
Yes.
Equality can make sense because you can, in a way, measure it by seeing if people have similar outcomes and opportunities relative to each other. But what the student wondered is, if we all share in bigness, won't it eventually negate itself? Because what is bigness? Is it share of all the resources? Then you split the resources up equally, and then suddenly you're at equality again. And also, what bigness relative to what? What is the, we're more big than ants, we're more big than we were 300 years ago, but we're less big than our imagination. So defend bigness a bit, and how is it not just eventually, once everyone shares in bigness, isn't that equality again?
So that's interesting. Let me remind you of the context of the question that is raised here. I said that the contemporary progressives on the whole take as their defining goal equality, equalization. And as their method, the humanization of the established institutional order, especially through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. Therefore, against the background of institutional conservatism or skepticism, the profession of egalitarian faith, which may seem very radical when viewed in the abstract, is brought down to size when it is combined with the other element of the institutional conservatism or skepticism. And in that combination, it yields as a pragmatic residue the focus on retrospective redistribution by progressive taxation and social entitlements. Now, I contrasted that position to the view that I attributed to the 19th century liberals and socialists. For them, the overriding goal was not simply equality. It was greatness. They shared the view, which I myself believe is correct, that the central idea in politics is always the idea of greatness, whether it is given a left-wing or a right-wing form. And they viewed the struggle against entrenched inequality as subsidiary to this larger goal. And entrenched inequality would be incompatible with a shared greatness. And their method was the method of structural change, that is, change in the institutional arrangements of society. Now, with respect to the method, I emphasized that these 19th century liberals and socialists, were characterized by an institutional dogmatism. Each current of opinion proposed a definitive formula. And we living now in this historical circumstance, can no longer bring ourselves to believe fully in these formulas. So thus arises a unique and in some respects unprecedented historical predicament. How it is that we can envisage and implement structural alternatives without succumbing to structural dogmatism. We need a different way of thinking. And we need to give great importance in these institutional alternatives to one particular set of attributes, namely the extent to which these alternative arrangements lend themselves to correction and change in the light of experience. Now, with respect to the goal, the idea of greatness that the 19th century progressives had was, on the whole, very narrowly cast in the mold of the aristocratic ideal of self-possession. And you notice, especially in the classic liberal thinkers like Tocqueville or John Stuart Mill or Alexander Humboldt or Herzen, the concern that modern democracy would result in a society of sheep, of conformists, and that this would be a calamity. And even the leftists, like Karl Marx, in their discourse about the future, emphasized an idea of empowerment, of agency, which in the 19th century context was largely aristocratic. So then the question you raise with respect to this goal of bigness and how it is to be reimagined is, first of all, to what extent does it imply a hierarchy? So bigness, in one conception of bigness, is lording it over other people, displaying powers and prerogatives that they lack. And we have this vision developed in the ideas of a number of philosophers. For example, in Nietzsche. And clearly a progressive version of the idea of bigness could not accept that conception, that bigness represents dominion over others. So we have to reject that. And its view is that bigness means the amplification of vitality and capability, the carrying of human life to a higher plane, greater intensity, more scope, more capacity. And in particular capacity of a particular kind, capacity to turn the tables on the circumstance in which we find ourselves. Now, in principle and in the abstract, the enhancement of agency, our capacity to construct, to create, to innovate, should not depend intrinsically on the ability to command others, because individual agency is associated with collective agency. But you are pointing to a very crucial distinction in the conception of agency. So, what forms of bigness are free from the taint of subjugation? It depends on the details. It depends on the forms of political and economic life that we imagine. So, for example, to take a theme, one of the many themes discussed in this course that could be regarded as a particular instance of this idea of bigness, the idea that no worker should be condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. The machine does everything that we have learned how to repeat, that we can express in a formula, and therefore embody in a physical contraction, the better to save our time for the not yet repeatable. Now, that's an instance, a special case of this large idea of bigness. We become bigger, more alive, more masters of the circumstance, to the extent that our supreme resource, which is our time, is not consumed in formulaic activities. In principle, in the abstract in general, such a form of bigness, to take this example, requires no subjugation. It's not like the Nietzschean idea that someone is the master and then someone else must be the slave. But the example illustrates that the reality of this project depends on its institutional expression. And I would say that every major proposal discussed in the course with regard to democratizing the market or equipping the individual through education or deepening democracy through the creation of a high-energy democracy represents an example and an interpretation of this idea of shared bigness. There's no single variant of those proposals which intrinsically depends on this practice of lording it over others. They're all collective. They're collective practices. So that's, I think, the basic answer to your question. But what the question demonstrates is that the 19th century idea of greatness was too narrow. And it drew its power from its association with an aristocratic ideal that is, if not unacceptable, at least inadequate under democracy. So we need another idea of greatness. And this other idea of greatness has resonance with another conception that has recurred here in our arguments, which is the conception of transcendence. Greatness and transcendence are kindred concepts. So transcendence means there is more in us, in each of us individually, and in all of us collectively, than there is or ever can be in the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite with regard to us, and we are infinite with regard to them. And we then want a world, a social world, institutionally organized, that not only recognizes this crucial attribute of ours, our infinity, our transcendence, but that respects it, develops it, allows for its deployment in practical social life. And that's then the idea of bigness, of shared bigness. In both its secular roots in Romanticism and its religious roots in the Semitic monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, it was not associated with an idea of lording over others. And so it shouldn't be as well in this political use to which we would devote it. So that's my answer. At least that's the beginning of an answer. But I think it's very natural for us to associate the idea of bigness or the idea of greatness with power over others. And it requires a spiritual and at the same time a practical and institutional reconstruction to rescue it from that association. Yes.
What are like some historical examples of radical reform? It doesn't have to be political. It can be when you were like talking about religions, for example.
So what's a historical example of radical reform?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah, and something that maybe like we talked about the 20th century, like agriculture reform. But
So
what about like previous examples?
yeah. So again, let me situate the question. I argued that the discussion of programmatic alternatives has to be informed by our ability to think structurally, to have an understanding of structural discontinuity in history. And that's all against the grain of the dominant currents of thought. In the positive social sciences, in the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory, and in the humanities. The structural insight, the structural concern, is presented to us not in contemporary social science, but in the history of classical European social theory. And for the left, especially in Marxism. So the idea that the structures of society are not natural, they're not part of the furniture of the universe. They're a kind of frozen fighting. This is how we should think of them. So there's a struggle over the terms of our relation to one another. And from time to time, most of the time, this struggle is interrupted or contained. So you could think of it as a kind of game of musical chairs. The music stops. What's the music? The music is the fighting, the practical fighting and the visionary fighting. The music stops and people sit down. And what they sit down on, the chairs, are the structures of social life. That's the basic idea of structure in this tradition of classical social thought.
Like how about
Now the problem is that in this tradition, this revolutionary insight is circumscribed, compromised, and to some extent undermined by a series of deterministic assumptions. And I emphasize 3 sets of assumptions. First, the idea of closure. There's a closed menu of alternative regimes, as in Marxism, the modes of production. The second idea is the idea of indivisibility. Each of these regimes is an indivisible system. And therefore, either we replace one system by another, revolution, or we humanize or manage one of these systems, reform. And the third idea is the idea of a law-like succession of these indivisible regimes in history. That's the idea. And the problem is that all of these ideas are false. And the whole history of modern thought is a discovery of their falsehood, which directly or indirectly is recognized even by the adherents to these ideas. So they continue to use the vocabulary, for example, the vocabulary of Marxism, without believing in the heroic assumptions of the theory. And there then results an immense confusion in contemporary political discourse. And without appreciating that confusion, it's impossible to understand the character of our contemporary discourse about politics and about alternatives. So people use the vocabulary of class struggle, or they use the term capitalism, without subscribing to the heroic assumptions of Marxist theory. They have the words, but not the faith. And the result is confusion. So that's the situation. So in the course of this debate, in which I say we need to save the structural insight from the baggage of these deterministic assumptions, one of the assumptions that I focused on was this false binary view of politics. It's either revolutionary substitution of one system for another, or it's reformist management of another system. That binary idea excludes what is most important in politics and in transformative practice, which is the piecemeal substitution of the structure. The idea of revolution is like a myth. It's a limiting case. And real structural change in history is almost invariably fragmentary. That's what I mean by radical reform. So, example. We discuss the so-called business cycle, or the political business cycle, in contemporary politics, in contemporary economic life. Let me just give the example of radical reform. It's based on certain premises, the contemporary form of the business cycle, or of the political business cycle. And one of its premises is Keynesian counter-cyclical management of the economy, the apparatus of contemporary fiscal and monetary policy. That was an invention. That was an invention that began in the 1930s, not just a theoretical invention of Keynes and his disciples, but a practical invention of those who govern the state. And it was an invention that replaced the pre-existing practical political economy. It was characterized by the gold standard, which tied the hands of national governments. Michal Kalecki, one of the most penetrating economists of the 20th century, remarked that the practical function of the gold standard was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. It tied the hands of the state. And now, in contemporary political economic life, there are any number of functional equivalents to the 19th century gold standard. For example, the Latin American republics of the late 20th century invented a functional equivalent to the gold standard, which was a combination of economic policies that acquiesced in a very low level of domestic saving, a consequent dependence on foreign capital, and an opening of the capital account to capital flows, making the state dependent on international financial confidence. And as with the gold standard, this dependence on financial confidence, rather than being seen as a problem, was seen as a solution, because it was viewed by the conservative economists and politicians as a way of impeding populist and autarkic adventurism. So then comes Keynesianism. Keynesianism supersedes the gold standard and changes the shape of contemporary politics and contemporary economic policy. That's an example of radical reform. Because if you ask, well, is it still, quote, capitalism, or is it another system? It doesn't make sense. It's another arrangement with another set of routines. The routines in this case are the political business cycle. But there's been a change, a part of the structure. What's interesting about this particular example is that it highlights a characteristic feature of radical reform, which is that it is characteristically always both a change in institutions and policies and a change in ideas, as practical Keynesianism was. Now, that's what happens all the time. That's what history is full of. The way that anything really changes in the world is by piecemeal transformation. And the idea of the systemic substitution is really just a fantasy. And to a large extent in contemporary experience, this fantasy has become an alibi for its opposite. And this is a very interesting feature of the contemporary situation. So, as I mentioned, many countries in the world now are governed by ex-Marxists. So the way they think is the following. Real change would be the substitution of, quote, capitalism by socialism. Well, that's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do is to humanize the existing order. So it's as if the fantasy of the revolutionary systemic substitution were turned on its head and became a pretext for surrender. So we'll become institutionally conservative social democrats because that's what's left to do in the world, given that this other thing is impossible or too dangerous. But it's completely mistaken because it's a way of thinking that excludes the principal business of transformative practice, which is this piecemeal transformation of the structure, as illustrated by the example that I gave of the introduction of practical Keynesianism. And so that's the real world. That's how change really happens. And of course, every fragmentary change is ambiguous or ambivalent because it can always be either a way of preempting or preventing more fundamental change, or it can be a step further to more change in a particular direction. In transformative practice, in politics, the meaning of a movement or of a change always depends on what comes next. So it doesn't wear its meaning on its surface. Its meaning is always ambiguous. Its meaning is given retrospectively by the succession. And anyone who's involved in the attempt to struggle with the world and to change it has to use these ambiguities because that's what we have, these contradictions. And should not then appeal to this idea of systemic substitution as an apology for surrender, which is what usually happens.
Like,
yes?
I was also trying to ask if there are examples you would give, let's say, from 13th century or like even way before than the modern economy.
Well, of course. So it's not a characteristic of 19th and 20th century societies alone. It's all of history. All of history is about this. So, for example, before the rise of these so-called capitalist societies, the main protagonists in world history were these great imperial bureaucratic empires, like the Ming-Qing Empire, or the Ottoman Empire, or the Mughal Empire. In fact, also the late Roman Empire. And in these empires, there was also a series of characteristic dilemmas of reform. Characteristically, the holders of imperial power to prevent the degeneration of the empire into a conflict of warlords who grabbed land from the peasantry, had to establish an alliance with the class of smallholders, of independent smallholders, who would be the base for military recruitment and for taxation. And they then tried to establish a direct channel to these smallholders and to preserve them against dispossession by the landholding magnates. The initiatives by which they did this were examples of revolutionary reform. And all the periods of relative prosperity and stability in the history of these empires were dependent on these exercises of statecraft. So that's history. That's what all history is. There's a structure. How will we master it and change it? The only way, practically the only way in which we can ever change it is to change it piecemeal. That's the only way we can do it. That's the only thing that's real. The other thing is just a fantasy, that we'd somehow jump out of this structure and be in some completely different structure. So, but this is a very serious problem in the political imagination, because given the history of social theory, we tend to associate a gradualist or fragmentary method with moderation or conservatism, and a wholesale method with revolutionary effects. But the truth is that radical transformation is almost invariably the consequence of cumulative, fragmentary, and gradual change. Because, to one extent or another, that's the only change there is. So, and there's a confusion of the idea of wholesale change with political violence. So, for example, in Tocqueville's classic work on the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution, the main theme is how similar the post-revolutionary regime was to the pre-revolutionary regime. They thought that by an act of will, they could escape history. And will is associated with violence. Then in Hegel's treatment of the French Revolution in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the analysis of violence is that violence is an expression of the impotence of the transformative will, which is trying to force a change which it is unable to obtain from the structure. Now, one of the intellectual traditions that was well equipped to rebel against these intellectual prejudices was the philosophical tradition of American pragmatism. Because the American pragmatists, in principle, in philosophy, never committed the mistake of associating experimentalism or gradualism with conservatism. Unfortunately, the political significance of this pragmatist tradition in the United States was to some extent annulled or neutralized by the institutional fetishism of the Americans, which has a different history. So the Americans were attracted to the idea that the country discovered at the formative moment of the Republic the definitive formula of a free society. And the rest of humanity would either have to subscribe to it or continue to languish in poverty and despotism. So the market economy has a natural form. The Constitution deserves to be the object of a cult because the divinely inspired founders had discovered how a democracy has to be organized and so forth. This is a calamity for the Americans, though to this day they don't understand that it's a calamity. So the result of the combination, the result of this institutional idolatry that is a characteristic of their political culture was to annul, to some extent, to neutralize the political significance of the pragmatist experimentalism. So it's like two sides of their culture which they were unable adequately to combine. Now, it has to be done. And now there's a practical reason why it has to be done. Let's just focus on the economic example. In political economy, as I've argued many times in the course, for the most part, the progressives, the progressive political economists, have only ideas on the demand side of the economy. Their basic political economy is vulgar Keynesianism. And for the most part, they abandon the supply side of the economy to the conservatives, who have a reified view of the market economy. There is a basic difference between change on the demand side and change on the supply side. Change on the demand side can be done just with money. You fund more consumption, credit, popular credit. You have a fake credit democracy instead of a property-owning democracy. You have expansionary monetary and fiscal policy, or even helicopter money, as it's called, and so forth. But change on the supply side can't be done with money. It requires institutional innovation, and particularly innovation in the institutional arrangements of the market economy. And then you need to have ideas about the alternative ways of organizing the market order. The institutional idolatry then becomes a fatal incubus. So this is a very practical impediment. It's not just a problem of philosophical culture. It's a disaster. It's like a train that has to be broken at many different levels, all the way from the theoretical to the practical. Yes?
I want to go back to the previous point.
Yes.
About bigness.
Bigness.
I had a couple of questions about that, but before that I wanted to make sure that we understood what you meant by increasing agency, and that so far I've understood it as maximizing one's ability to realize their will, so to speak. And what exactly? An increase of agency can mean a great many deal of things.
Yes.
I understood it more as how well being practiced in the world with greater force and with greater frequency. So would that be correct?
So it means it has different connotations that are connected. But one connotation of an enhancement of agency is that it is a capacity to turn the tables on the framework, on the context that we're in, rather than just to take it for granted. So again, I can explain it in very general and abstract terms by alluding, once again, to the contrast between two sets of moves that we can make. So we can make moves, routine moves, within a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. Let's say that's routine life, routine economic life, routine discursive activity. And then there are exceptional moves by which from time to time we challenge and change pieces of the framework of arrangements and assumptions within which these routine moves take place. Now, one interpretation of what it means to enhance agency is that we diminish the distance between these two sets of moves, so that our ability to change and challenge pieces of the framework arises more continuously and naturally out of the ordinary business of life. So it's not as if transformation were an ecstatic or extraordinary activity dependent on crisis. It's, now, let me give you another analogy which may help make this conception of the enhancement of agency more palpable. You know, in the history of science and in the philosophy of science, the distinction popularized by people like Thomas Kuhn between routine science and revolutionary science. So routine science is science conducted under a paradigm, say the paradigm of Newtonian mechanics, that is accepted and left unchallenged. And revolutionary science is the substitution of the paradigm. And in the history of science, we think traditionally that the substitution of paradigms is the affair of geniuses. And the routine scientists are doing routine science under a paradigm. Now, in science, what it would mean to enhance agency, one of the things that would mean is that routine science would win some of the attributes of revolutionary science, and that the distinction between routine science and revolutionary science would be relativized. Now, this is something very profound if we imagine that as just an example of the whole of our activity. The fundamental question presented to us is, are we just the puppets of the world in which we are thrown by the accidents of our birth? Or are we something greater? Can we turn the tables on this world? Can we master it? Can we make it ours, collectively as individually? That's greatness, in this sense of shared greatness. And in a sense, I think that a shared characteristic of all of the proposals that I've advanced in the arguments of this course, all of them, the ones about democratizing the market, the ones about equipping the individual through education, and the ones about deepening democracy, are related to that problem. That's a shared characteristic of all of these proposals, is that they have to do with our ability to turn the tables on the framework in just that way, and to create a framework which facilitates its own revision and is therefore a worthier template for a context-transcendent agent, such as we are or should wish to become. So this idea of the bigness and of its relation to mastery of the framework is in opposition to two heresies, and which we might call the Hegelian heresy and the Sartrean heresy. So imitating the habit of patristic theology, of giving to heresies the names of individuals. So by the Hegelian heresy, I mean the idea that there's at the end of history, a definitive institutional framework, which is the final home of the spirit. So at last we're at home. At last there's no contradiction between our humanity and a particular world. That's what I mean by the Hegelian heresy. And an assumption of all of the arguments here is that there is no such definitive home of the spirit. Some are better than others, but none are definitive. All are flawed, all are finite. We exceed all of them, although some are much better than others. Now, then there's another heresy on the other side, which is what you might call the Sartrean heresy. It's the romantic heresy or the existentialist heresy. So there the view is structures, institutional structures, are like the hand of Midas. They kill the spirit. They turn life into gold, dead gold. And we can't impede their reassertion. What we can do is to shake them from time to time. And then we'll only be fully alive in these interludes in which we shake the rule of the structures. So that's romantic love against the routines of married life, or it's the mob in the streets against the routines of the bureaucratic apparatus. That's the romantic idea. And it really is a form of despair, because it's a despair about the possibility of changing the relation of self or spirit to structure. And as I have rejected the Hegelian heresy, I've also rejected the Sartrean heresy, because an underlying assumption of my arguments is that we can hope to change over time the relation of spirit to structure, and to create structures that are better templates for our context-transcending activities. And that all of our material and moral interests, our interests in economic growth and innovation, in emancipation, are engaged in the effort to create such structures over time. And so that's part of the background of this idea of agency. So to the extent that we succeed in this project over time, we make ourselves bigger. We make ourselves bigger collectively. But then we have another problem. So here's now another facet of the problem of agency. This project of making ourselves bigger through change in the character as well as in the content of institutional arrangements is a project that takes place only in historical time. It doesn't take place on the dimension of a human lifetime. And we don't get to choose the moment of history in which we're born and how far we are in this progression. So, for example, I've said early in the course, I've said, and I believe, that we happen to be living in a counter-revolutionary interlude in a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity? Well, what should our attitude to our own lives be in relation to that historical circumstance? To what extent will we allow the character of our individual existence, which has a certain number of years, of decades, to be defined by this historical accident? And a fuller view of agency, of greatness, can't allow individual existence to be governed in this way by the stars. So we have to have the collective project, but we also have to have a biographical project in which we will rebel against the rigidities of our own character. We will use our transformative engagement as a way of tearing from us the shield of invulnerability and subjecting us to circumstances in which we can be shaken up. And that will be another source of the enhancement of agency. So by introducing this theme, what I'm suggesting to you is that the enhancement of agency or bigness is more than just a political problem that can be resolved in biographical time. It's also a personal and, in historical time, it's also a personal and existential problem that we can address only in biographical time, by means that are not just political. So agency is connected on one side to transcendence, transcendence over context. And it's connected on another side to life, to vitality, to the attributes of life, which are surfeit, spontaneity, and surprise. So the Santayana said of William James the following, one American philosopher speaking of another. He said of William James, he was so extremely natural that there was no way of knowing what his nature was or what came next. So that's a description of vitality, that there isn't a formula. And that's what we should all want for ourselves. And we can't get it just from politics. So it's that. So I think that a view of the enhancement of agency that is focused only on the political sphere is too narrow. And we have to have a larger view. Yes?
You talked about, well, my question is about the limitations of this enhancement.
Yes.
You talked about enhancing agency and, rearranging the economy and deepening democracy and equipping individual education. But there's another aspect of society where I feel like you haven't mentioned yet, but I'm also curious where enhancement of agency will run into conflict, and that's public health. And I'm just wondering how you would kind of promote, how you would advance agency, individual agency, while also accounting for health of society. And I'm thinking of vaccines in particular, but also the practice of safe sex, things like this. How do you grapple with that?
Well, I need to understand more your concern, so elaborate further.
So there's one debate that's going on in the public health circles, is the debate between public health advocates who believe that everyone should be practicing safe sex, and then there's the sex-positive advocates who believe that that there's a role for human agency in this debate that's missing. And as a result, there's all sorts of negative byproducts of human shame and marginalization as a result when someone does contract a disease.
Mhm.
And so many of my friends kind of wrestle in this space and have a really hard time articulating the need to enhance and promote human agency while also, promoting best practices, research, evidence to suggest that there are very effective ways at protecting society and yourself from harmful diseases.
Yeah, so, but it seems that what we're addressing is a problem which is somewhat different from this problem of agency, which is the relation of individual experimentation to social responsibility. So that's another problem. It's connected, but it's a distinct problem, and of course it's a problem that has no formulaic solution. And the radicalness of experimentation has to be connected with a mitigation of harms to others. So I think that, but it introduces, I think, what another set of discussions. I was thinking that you were going in another direction, which was this question of the provision of public services through the engagement of civil society beyond the limits of administrative Fordism on one side, the provision of standardized low-quality services in health or in education, and the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms on the other side. So the best way to enhance the quality of public services is to engage independent civil society, for example, through cooperative forms of organization, as a partner of the state in the experimental and competitive provision of social services. And it is a mistake to associate that idea of competitive and experimental provision with profit-driven market activity. It need not be. So that's another way in which we can think of the enhancement of agency. Because what are public services? Public services are the instruments by which we bill people. Education, health. And the fundamental idea is society should build itself through its engagement together with the state in the experimental provision of these public services. And that's yet another way of giving practical significance and power to the idea of the enhancement of agency. Yes?
Thank you. Professor, I am interested in what the good life is. I was very interested and taken by your thoughts on the matter, particularly this idea that the good life seemed at one point to me that your idea of the good life was one of engaging actively in some form of production through life. And interestingly, as your thoughts evolved, you came to this definition of production as something that we don't, human production, this kind of an exalted production being something that cannot be done by machines. So in a way, it's a form of creativity, right? It's a form of a human-only capability. Interestingly, I was thinking about what the good life was for the ancients, and I was thinking particularly of Aristotle and his definition of the good life as something that happens only in society, interestingly. And it is really something that we can only do if kind of these mechanical problems of existence are taken care of.
Yes.
And I started to see a correspondence, which I wanted you to comment on, between the Aristotelian life of contemplation, which is really not that dissimilar from, it would seem to me, from this kind of uniquely human productivity, which is the productivity of creation and of, why not say it, maybe thought and philosophy. And so I was particularly interested in hearing your thoughts on the differences and similarities between what you are presenting as the life worth attaining and the ancients' conception of the good life.
Yeah. Well, first let's take a step back to a debate that I pointed to but have not explored in this course, because here the main focus is programmatic alternatives. And it's all connected to the philosophical debates, like the debate you just mentioned. But we're struggling with this absurd vehicle of 12 classes in a semester and different courses and so forth. So it requires separations which have no justification other than the imposition of the circumstance in which we find ourselves. So I signaled to a debate, I said, we can't accept the premise of classical liberal political theory of a radical, watertight distinction between the right and the good. You mentioned the idea of the good life. So in classical liberal political theory, the notion is the order of right, which is the institutional order and the order of the law, must be neutral among visions of the good. Now, there is no such order. There is no institutional order, and there will never be, that is neutral among visions of the good. Because every institutional order tilts the scales, encouraging some forms of human experience and discouraging others. The claim of neutrality is invariably adduced in the service of an attempt to entrench, in the name of neutrality, one sectarian vision of the good. So it produces the opposite of the effect that it announces. Nevertheless, this illusory aim of neutrality has a kinship to a goal that is legitimate and realistic, but that should not be confused with this idea of neutrality. And this is the goal of openness, of catholicity, of contradiction. So we can't aspire to have an institutional order that's neutral, and every institutional order is an experiment in humanity, and that's why we want there to be many such experiments in the world rather than a world state. But each of these orders should be open and contradictory and corrigible in the light of experience. And each of them should be arranged in a way that allows the individual to turn against it. That's the claim. Now, then, your question, against the background of this clarification, raises the view of what are some of the characteristics of the view of the good with which the particular direction that I advocated is associated. And how could we think of it in relation to the ideal that is designed in the classical virtue ethics, what in the history of philosophy we call eudaimonism, the ancient eudaimonism, that there's a canonical set of virtues that allows the human being to flourish, and that's the good. And then the society should be the political template for this vision of human flourishing. Now, I have to say that I don't believe that the arguments about alternatives that I've developed here, or that other moderns develop, is compatible with a view like the Aristotelian view. It's not just a question of method, it's a question of the content. So remember Aristotle's description of the virtues. each virtue is a mean between two extremes. Virtue is moderation. Courage is a mean between, say, rashness and servility, and so forth. Now, the essential spirit of this view is captured even more clearly in what seem to be the peripheral details of the exposition than in the central canonical doctrines. For example, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle describes the characteristic gait of a magnanimous man. The magnanimous man is the master who displays these virtues, the human floor. How does he walk? It seems trivial, but it's very revealing. So he walks purposely with a measured and stately gait. If he walked slowly and stumbled around, he would appear to be lost, and that would be undignified. And if he walked hastily, he would seem to be anxious, as if he were fleeing from something or from himself. And that also would be undesirable. So he should be a fully integrated personality, walking slowly in a measured way, as if the world were his oyster. Now, is that what we want for ourselves? That's not our ideal. So we have come to think that it's good to be lost. And it's, in some respects, even good to be anxious. And that contradiction is better than serenity. So here we have a fundamental moral contrast. Let me state it in one of its multiple forms. Should we stay out of trouble? That's what Aristotle believed. Or should we look for trouble? That's what we believe, or what we should believe. And that's a different conception of human life. And two of the turning points in this transformation of the vision of the good are, first, the idea of the infinity of the self, its indefinite depth, not of a small cadre of exceptional individuals, heroes and geniuses and saints, but of ordinary humanity. And the second assumption is the radical transformability of society, so that there is no social template of individual existence that we have reason to accept as definitive, the rejection of the Hegelian heresy, as I called it. So the conception that we progress to serenity and to an integration of the personality, and at the end, we become masterful in the course of our life and are neither lost nor anxious, is a conception that we have come to reject. And Christianity and Romanticism in our civilization have both contributed to this rejection. And this has been a moral revolution, which results in the repudiation of the ancient eudaimonism. Now, it still, of course, persists because of our general confusion. So that's what I would say, that the more complicated view of the good, which is defined in part by negation, by the rejection of this ancient eudaimonism.
If I may, I mean, I'd like
Yes.
to offer an alternative view.
Yes.
In the sense that you do point to Aristotle, who has this kind of problematic formulaic approach to the virtues. I agree. But if we look at Socrates, and if we look at the apology, which is really ultimately the ultimate act of rejection of the order, right? It is basically a defiant cry of open challenge to the order and to the ways of society. And if we look at his definitions, through Plato, obviously, but his definitions of what the good life is, I'm struck actually by how similar the idea of contemplation and the good life for him is to what your idea of the ultimate uniquely human process of production is, which is thinking and creating with our minds, because everything else can be mechanized.
I can't agree with you, but it would be a long discussion. So first of all, now you mentioned Socrates. Now in the space of 2 lifetimes, we've gone from one conceptual world to another, the world of Plato, since Socrates, after all, is just a figure in the ideas and in the dialogues of Plato. Otherwise, we have no access to him. And there we have a completely different view. In Plato, a view that was characteristic of a whole series of Indo-European civilizations. The idea of a hierarchy of impulses in the soul, reason on top, the action-oriented impulses in the middle, the sensual appetites below, an order in the cosmos, the ultimate realities, in Plato, the theory of forms, but in each other version, a different variant of this idea, and then the bridge between order in the soul, between soulcraft and cosmic order, is the political order, also hierarchical. And then, in the particular dialogue you mentioned, the figure of Socrates. So Socrates is condemned by the democracy, but in the end, he dies in a dignified form. That's not what happened later. Christ does not die in a dignified form. He's nailed to the cross in an undignified way, and he cries out, unlike Socrates, "Why have you abandoned me?" It's a totally different world, and this may seem tangential to our discussion, but all of these modern, these programmatic discussions that we're having about society are enveloped or related to a different conception of the human personality. It's a conception in which this ideal of integration, of self-possession, of serenity, has lost its authority. And we've come to think something completely different, which is that we can save ourselves only by losing ourselves. And it's a different conception of human existence. Huh? In a fuller set of arguments, these ideas about politics and about institutions that we've explored here would have to be developed in a parallel set of ideas about the personality and its transformation, and a different conception of happiness. So this loosely is an occasion to remind you here of one of the basic assumptions I'm making in the arguments of this course, which is not a self-evident assumption. And I should make it more explicit. So I just said before, a moment ago, we are living in a counter-revolutionary interlude in a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. So this revolutionary period has been driven forward by two large families of projects. On one side are the political projects of democracy, liberalism, socialism, the destruction of the rigid class order of society, the association of our practical economic progress with our emancipation from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy. That's the revolutionary political message, which is the dominant political message in the world for the last 200 or 300 years. That's the political side. But it's not the only side. So then there's the other side, which is the personalist side. That every individual has godlike attributes. So we become more human by becoming more godlike. And the carrier of this personalist side of the revolutionary project is the worldwide romantic culture, especially the popular romantic culture. So in a Brazilian slum or in an Indian village, the poor person sees the TV soap opera or listens to the popular music. And the message that is conveyed is the message of infinity. It's fantastic. This is a revolutionary event in the history of humanity. Now, received without immediate connection to practical experience. So in a fantasy of empowerment and escape that has no immediate resonance in practical life. But it's a tremendous message. And so that's the other side of the project, of this romantic thing. And one of the enigmas has always been that the relation between these two sides of the project is obscure or undeveloped. They're connected. But we know that there was a fateful parting of the ways in the West between modernism and leftism, between the personal and the political, and that the two sides of this project were not explicitly and clearly connected in thought and in practice, even though deeply they are connected. Now, my view of the situation is that this project, with its two sides, the political side and the personal side, remains, as it has been for the last 200 or 300 years, the most powerful project in the world. It commands the agenda of humanity. It's not the only project. It has enemies. So it's in a contest with opposing projects. But it is the project that commands the agenda. And in that sense, it's the strongest project. All the other projects respond to it, react to it. But in another sense now, it has become also a weak project. It has become a weak project in this sense that its adepts, among whom I count myself, no longer know what its next step should be. So it's lost. We see this most clearly with respect to the political project. So institutionally conservative social democracy is a characteristic expression of this revolutionary project being lost. What happens next? What's the next step? We don't know. We contemporaries don't know. And so there's this retrenchment to this humanization effort. So then there's the fundamental political question, which is prior, in a sense, to any division between left and right, is what is our attitude to this project? Do we want it to go on, or don't we want it to go on? And if we want it to go on, how could it go on? It can't go on unless we reinvent it. So we have to give it new meaning, new institutional form, a new set of moral ideas. So it's always this paradox in our activities that we have to give it up in order to be able to regain it. If we cling to it in its present form, it dies. And that's the situation that I'm describing as it's being lost. So in some sense, we have to renounce it and reinvent it to make it live. And to my mind, that's what this is all about. So it has a very particular historical meaning. Finding ourselves in this circumstance of being in the counter-revolutionary interlude in the long revolutionary period. Some of us want the revolution to go on. But how? And then we have to reinvent it. It has to have a different content. It has to have a different form. That's how I see it. And of course, it can't be just or primarily a spiritual campaign. It has to engage, to be effective, it has to engage with the practical problems that humanity is interested in. Economic growth, making it more inclusive, the relation between the problem of stagnation and the problem of inequality, and so forth. So these are, as it were, the footholds for this project. Its ability to engage with these problems that have immediate significance and to suggest a different take on them. But the impulse is the impulse of making the project live in a new form. Yes?
So I have 3 questions, which you don't have to answer all of them, just answer your favorite. First, I think that's really interesting what you just were speaking about, and I think there's a fair number of people in our society who consider this good enough, right? Who think, there's
What's the this? The this is the present order of things,
present
or what?
institutional
Yeah.
and political economic order.
Yes.
That there's enough safety, enough security, enough liberty that I can do kind of what I want to in my social life and my business life, right? And you've outlined some sort of first steps of what we could take in order to go in the direction of this vision for progressive alternative, a real alternative society. But that requires mobilization of people to gain that support for instance, renewed federalism. So the question is, how do you mobilize people out of a sense that, you know what, this is fine. It's not perfect, but this is fine. This is enough for me. Which, even if you're suffering in the society in a real way, and you're in a marginalized or oppressed group, it's still there's still a lot of fear of what change would bring. So that's my first question. Second question is in regard to this.
But wait a minute, before you go on to the second question, answer your first question.
How do you mobilize people?
Well, what's the answer to your what's the beginning of an answer to that first question?
I don't know. I think it's convincing people that having conversations and discussions and a sort of consciousness raising about the extent to which we're not free and not connected.
But you're making it sound too philosophical. I mean, there are practical issues. So take an issue which is now at the center of American politics and of European politics, which is the fate of the traditional working class caught in declining mass production industry, or the small business class in these retrograde traditional family businesses. So in the absence of an idea about the conversion of mass production into something else, an inclusive vision of the knowledge economy, there's the negative view that all you can do is to prolong a little bit the life of the declining mass production industries by restraints on trade, by subsidies to the mass production industry. Curiously, the progressives and the right-wing populists seem to converge in the same idea. But it's an idea which they themselves can't possibly believe has much of a future. It's like a holding operation, right? So it's so that's not just a discussion about consciousness raising. It's a practical discussion about the central problems of the society. It's related to another practical discussion. The economists now in the United States have a discourse under the label of secular stagnation that attempts to naturalize the slowing of economic growth in the United States. And they attribute this to various factors, such as the idea that the contemporary technologies are intrinsically much less revolutionary than the technologies of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. These ideas make no sense. So there's the question of what happens to the workers in the declining mass production industries. There's a debate about stagnation and whether it's inevitable or there's some way to get out of it. These are real problems. These are the fundamental practical problems of these societies. And they're immediately connected to people's conception of their interests, their proximate material interests. So a basic claim here in the arguments of the course is that there's a way of defining and defending those interests that is socially solidaristic and institutionally transformative. It requires a different project. In the case of the mass production industries, it requires the vision of a more inclusive form of the knowledge economy, and that can only be promoted through a new institutional architecture of relations between the government and firms, or firms among themselves, and so forth. Now, so that's one foothold for a discussion that would engage people where they are in their beginning with their own understanding of their problems and of their interests, right? But the more this discussion is reproduced in other domains of social life, in education, in politics, the more the view of what is at stake expands little by little. And then we begin to see that it's not just a matter of our immediate material interests, but it's a matter of the range of our powers, the experience, the scope of an ordinary human life. That was the discussion we were having earlier today under the label of the enhancement of agency. And surely that's what always must happen in transformative practice, which is that we meet people where they are, and we address their problems in a language and by examples that they can understand. But we offer a down payment on an alternative future, which, as it moves in a certain direction, then leads them to reinterpret their interests and even their identities. So the character of practical politics and practical political discourse is that it is simultaneously always practical and prophetic. And so just yesterday in another course, the political economy course, I was having a discussion about this. And I was saying the following. Every alternative can be explored at points that are closer to what it now exists or further from what exists. It's not about blueprints. It's about a succession of steps. So I said, it's not architecture, it's music. Now, what happens is that in a setting like this one, in which the main aim is intellectual clarity, learning to think about the alternatives, there is an advantage in emphasizing the middle point of these trajectories. That is, initiatives described at a place that is neither very close to what exists nor very far from what exists. That's what I'm calling the middle point. And that's the position that I have generally preferred in the programmatic arguments here. This middle position. But the middle position from the standpoint of political discourse has a great disadvantage, which is that characteristically the proposals at this middle position risk seeming too distant from present reality to be feasible, but not distant enough to be inspiring. So this middle position, which I prefer in the academic setting of a programmatic argument for the sake of intellectual clarity, generally has to be avoided in practical politics. And in practical politics, we have to focus on the immediate next steps. That's what I'm calling the practical. And on the most remote, which is the prophetic. Transformative politics is practical and prophetic and avoids this middle distance. But it's the same trajectory. And what we have to understand in our own minds, if we are to have a deeper understanding, is that we have to be able to grasp these alternatives at all points in these trajectories, from the immediate to the middle to the distant. And patience for that. Not just many activities in many different settings, but many hours. Now, that was just your first question. What were your other questions?
Yeah, forget it. I'll give up my time. But that was great. That's very good.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, actually, did you want to say something? One more question. Yes.
Kind of along the lines of mobilizing,
Yes.
mobilizing people to this idea. Do you have like an approach for how you would make the idea of programmatic thought or more accessible, or at least more present in public dialogue, or is it?
I don't think it's a mystery. Remember the very first day of class. It was related to what we were just talking about. And it seems very appropriate now to repeat this at the end. So I say, I propose something to you. It's close to what exists. You say, well, that's feasible, but it's trivial. I propose something to you, and it's far away from what exists. You say, well, that's very interesting, but it's utopian. So everything that can be proposed in this climate of opinion is likely to seem to be either trivial or utopian. It's a misunderstanding of the nature of transformative practice and of programmatic argument. It's about a trajectory. It's about a direction. And every direction worth thinking about can be explored at points close to what exists or far from what exists. To live in the practical discourse, it has to combine the close and the far. So you have to be able to offer examples, what I'm calling down payments of the alternative. But then you have to represent those down payments under the prism of a view of a direction, far away. So that's this dialectic of the practical and the prophetic, which then arouses enthusiasm as it deepens insight. Now, there is an additional complication, which is created by the history of our ideas about society, the history of social theory, which is that the social theories that had structural insight, like Marxism, have ceased to be believable. Their own adepts don't believe in them, with their claims that there's this closed menu of options, that there are indivisible regimes, that there are laws of historical. They use the vocabulary, but they don't believe in the theory. And the result is that we do not have readily available to us now a credible understanding of how structural change happens in history. In the absence of such an understanding, we fall back on a fake criterion of political realism, which is that a proposal is realistic to the extent that it is close to what already exists. Well, that's an absurd idea of political realism. That's not a conception. That's just a kind of declaration of intellectual bankruptcy. But it has the result of enhancing this false dilemma of programmatic argument. So we could go on forever, and I wish we would. But the scourge of human existence is time. So
just I something on this, like very briefly.
Yes.
I mean, at a, like a personal level, like, would you consider, let's say, going to different countries and like presenting your plan, for example, of like, okay, like so that there are like some ways of using media and
I wouldn't
culture.
just consider it. I've tried to do it, but seriously, no. But seriously, we have a problem. So I don't believe. I don't share the characteristic idea of the contemporary progressives that the heresies in the world are local heresies. It's a very characteristic belief now. There's a universal orthodoxy, sometimes called neoliberalism, or its combination with institutionally conservative social democracy. The heresies are all local. And the local heresies are combinations of pieces of the universal orthodoxy with adaptations to the local circumstance. The structural problems and alternatives of the world are analogous. And as a practical matter, a universal orthodoxy cannot be successfully combated by a local heresy. only universalizing heresies can combat universal orthodoxies, as liberalism and socialism were in the 19th century. But now Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill and their contemporaries had the idea and the practice of a world politics. So they didn't think of their proposals as proposals for this country or that country. They thought of their proposals as proposals for humanity. Now, we should think in the same way. But we have a problem, which is, although in a way the world is in practice much more connected now than it was then, we do not have the instruments, the flawed partial instruments which they had for the practice of world politics. How are we to do this? It's like we don't know in practice what this world politics would look like. So I guess that's another example of why it's so inappropriate for us, for each of us, to have the stately and measured gait of Aristotle's magnanimous man. We are at once anxious and lost, hastening and stumbling around. And I wish there would be more time to be lost and to stumble around. But in the meantime, I am immensely grateful for your patience. I've often been frustrated with this feeling that the vehicle is completely inappropriate. You know, it's just ridiculous to try and do this in the form of a course in one of these American universities with 11 or 12 classes and all this rigmarole of papers and grades and so forth. It's sort of comical. But we never have the adequate instruments for what we want to do if what we want to do is serious. So we have to seize on the instruments that exist and use them in Congress. And although I have been frustrated throughout by this incongruity, the actual experience of trying to do it has been immeasurably intoxicating. So thank you very much.
Reminder, we have dinner tonight at 7 p.m. If you still want RSVP, please see me. It's at Henrietta's table at Charles Hotel.
If anybody wants to come and can't afford it, I'll spot you.
If there are any law students in the room,
That's for anybody. What?
you should fill out this.
How's your term been? Yeah. Just heard today that there's going to be a UK election. It's a bit crazy and a bit scary. No, I mean, she had denied it for the last week.
That's not the first positive press I've seen. Really? Yeah.
That's weird. What's he done it?
Contract professor.
There's always one
Yeah.
Just as like,
Yeah, exactly. Then you would film it. More than lucky. Yeah.
so he's trying to challenge like what is the class? What is actually
My question is why is he not say actually using why does he try to build more? Just like Mark said, that's what we need to do. What is the problem order?
But yeah, I don't know. Come across but I would not say many of our lecturers ever would say that the reaction gathered here in this room was of a nature that
No.
would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you guys think of like business schools? Would they kind of transition to no, like my question is your question.
You know, I totally
saying that like
those
why
are
should they
super
like
personal, and I totally agree. The only challenges for this class is find a model.
I feel like the blames people that they don't know how about change, but that he doesn't have a way to change
Could also make
use like publicists on the
So,
he doesn't use like social media.
That doesn't mean totally
mobilize people
from
to share
there,
it.
like.
You know, like Marx would do it differently. You know, like for example, Marx, like he look at other people, the left muscle, like do that.
So, like deeply,
He was in Belgium,
and more
right? He was in
out there
Belgium,
and
which
distant
is
better. So
quite,
outline your
yeah,
vision.
that's
What is
pretty
that?
direct. Excellent.
Unger would probably say it's part of the caring.
Yeah.
Or like, he would say, Unger doesn't talk about
Starting with
so if you were building what is your vision?
something goes well, and then
You don't have to, but I would totally think this risk averse would be here's a quick description of the problem in America. Then outline a vision. Or second goal is abstract the problem. That's what are some generalized concepts? So don't just say the graph is that. Try to model it. Try to describe it. You know, like Chris Hayes just wrote this book. So he tried to say that
And it's just like, that's not going to appeal to everyone because it's like littered with classical philosophy references. I mean, it's just not.
And that's a really good job.
I mean, him on social media.
So he could have just said.
What would he say, you know, in a few characters? I just cannot imagine it would be the same thing every day.
like he talks about Asians, he talks about
Yeah, but it's like, this is a story. Beyond incarceration. So, do some modeling of what the current situation is.
Yeah, he's
Then
doing
say,
another
this
course
beckons
project.
the
He's
vision,
doing
alternate model. So,
because of this thing.
more an abstraction of reality to your vision, then bring it back down to concrete. What are some
Yeah.
steps?